So, my name is Grant Meller. I'm creative director and visual effects supervisor at Ingenuity Studios. So, a bunch of work that we've done. It's kind of tiny and difficult to see. We do really a wide variety of commercials, television, feature film, music videos. Just really kind of helps keep it creative and keep our work kind of fresh and enjoyable. And we've done a lot of cross-media stuff lately, and that's been really exciting for us. It's interesting to see how advertising and media in general have really, that whole landscape is just changing so rapidly. It's no longer just adverts on television and, just TV episodes. There's, everything is kind of intertwined and related now. Is this? Nope. I can't see this, so I'm going to have to keep just kind of looking back at what slide we're on. So the biggest thing I'm here to talk about today is getting started in VR. VR is really the Wild West currently. It's, we've been doing visual effects for movies for 40 years, and we have kind of an established set of guidelines and procedures and best practices for things, and we don't really have any of that for VR yet. And especially for the creative space and for the entertainment space, that's really exciting. And everyone's still kind of trying to figure out the best way to use that technology and the best way to engage audiences, because it's just so fresh and so new, and it's not really something that everyone has a lot of experience in yet. So when choosing a VR platform, you kind of hear about VR and you think of Oculus, you think of Vive, you think of the Gear, but really the biggest VR platform is Google Cardboard. They have 1 million shipped units. There's really just an absolute ton of cardboards out there, and no one else even comes close. So if you're wanting to make VR content and you're wanting to release it now or in the very near future, it's kind of your only choice. And I think the biggest reason for that is just that there's an absolutely rock bottom barrier to entry. So everyone that gets the New York Times now has a cardboard. My granddad has a cardboard sitting on his, he doesn't really know what to do with it. But he has a cardboard and is asked, what is this? What is this thing? He doesn't have a Rift. He's not going to get a high-end computer and plug it in and start playing video games, but he has this piece of technology that he can experience VR on, and I think that's really exciting for me, because it means that demographic isn't just 20-something guys that want to have a better frag fest on the weekends, and it's also very easy to use. So I can take his iPhone and put it in and download the app, and he can get around on the Rift, and it's so I think that's really a big benefit to it as well. But there are some drawbacks. And the biggest one is just that you're limited on performance. So you're running it on a phone. It's the same phone that you use every day. And that's a non-standard platform. So I have a Note 5, and maybe you have a Samsung S4 or an iPhone, like an old iPhone that's kind of crappy, and it's supposed to be able to run all of the same things magically. And so you kind of have to develop anything that you're doing for cardboard for the lowest common denominator, which is a little unfortunate, and kind of limits you in terms of what you can kind of push and what you can display. And then the second is that you're not strapped in. So if you watch the opening titles, they have cardboards set up out in Fed Square, by the way. You hold it up for 2 minutes to your head, and suddenly you're like, oh, my arms are tired. I don't want to do this anymore. And I can't imagine watching an hour-and-a-half movie, whereas I've watched the Netflix app and the Gear, and you're strapped in and you're on a plane and you're just hanging out in your log cabin watching the latest House of Cards, which maybe you guys don't get in Australia. Everyone complains that Australia, you have House of Cards. That's really nice. I'm really happy for all of you. So the next kind of step on this road to getting started in VR is choosing an engine. Choosing a 3D engine is kind of the choice I'm referring to here. And really, if you're choosing between an engine, you're choosing between Unity and Unreal. They're kind of the two biggest players, and there's the most resources, it makes the most, you can find the most developers, it makes the most sense to kind of use either of those options. So I'll kind of preface this. Most of our experience in real time has been with Unreal. So kind of coming into this project to do the opening titles, we were very biased. But the unfortunate part is that Unity is the only platform that supports Google Cardboard. Unreal, kind of Epic just kind of refuses to add support for the SDK and kind of integrate that in the same way that Unity has. So, that's where that choice comes from. So we chose Unity, but it kind of has a lot of drawbacks as well. The biggest being that all of the visual tools that you get with Unreal, that's kind of much more of a developed engine. You don't really have that stuff when you're working in Unity, so you have to do a lot by hand. But it kind of, doing it by hand, you end up with a smaller download size. You end up kind of knowing exactly what the code is doing and knowing kind of everything behind the scenes. So it's a kind of one of those downsides and upsides at the same time. And that kind of brings us around to constraints for mobile graphics. If you're running something on your phone, but you're trying to do VR, you're suddenly doing double the FPS that a normal phone game would run, if not more, and then you're rendering for 2 eyes for your left and right eye. So your performance is kind of effectively cut in fourth. So the amount of stuff that you can display, the amount of visuals that you can kind of push is really limiting. And then that performance for VR really is the thing that matters most. People would rather look at kind of a empty scene with a box in it and have it be responsive and have it be enjoyable than look at a beautiful visual that kind of stutters as you go, because the experience is just, it takes you out of it completely. You don't really feel engaged. You don't really feel like you're in a virtual space that you can control and you can look around on. And then the cell phone GPUs, just the way that they're set up, really kind of are limiting in the sense of draw speed and like the amount of stuff that they can push through compared to like a modern computer. So with that, we found it's very important to test performance, kind of early in the project. We found that it was going to be our greatest constraint when we were working on the titles. But style really kind of comes around and becomes a solution to that. And I think that's one of the most interesting parts about developing for VR currently, is that you have these games coming out that realize that they can't be photoreal, that they can't, kind of obtain the quality that a normal kind of 2D game is currently, but they solve that problem through style and through making stylistic choices and making something that's maybe even more beautiful or more interesting or more unique than kind of the normal, realistic, gritty, everything is brown, everything is covered in blood game that you would normally see. So I think it's kind of nice to give people that constraint and then see how they kind of work out of that box. And just a handful of performance tips on VR that we've kind of found. One of the biggest is baking all the lighting. You look around at the room, it's very complexly lit, but if we're walking around in it, that lighting's not really changing. It's changing slowly over the course of the day, but for our intents and purposes, it's not. So what we ended up doing was using Modo to bake all of that lighting into light maps and then go into the game, and that's what allows the titles to have realistic, beautiful lighting, but still run at real time on your phone, because to calculate that would take forever if you were trying to actually calculate that on your phone. Combining textures, just avoiding overdraw. So rendering on a phone and rendering on a game in general doesn't really work like how the real world works. So if I look out this window, there's a big building in the way and I can't see anything behind it, but on a phone, all of the stuff behind it is drawn first and then the building is drawn over top. So there's a lot of constraints like that you have to kind of be aware and kind of think your way out of. And then the biggest thing we found on the phone that helped our performance was just rendering less. So the cardboard, if anyone has any familiarity with it, the aspect ratio by default is square. So you're looking at a square frame, in each eye, but the last movie that you watched that was square was probably in like the 80s. Everything is widescreen, everything is very cinematic. So we just crop the top and crop the bottom, and no one really notices, but we're rendering like 40% less screen. So it's, you can come up with a lot of novel solutions, and we're one of the first kind of sequences or experiences on the cardboard that I've seen that does that, but it's totally fine, and you save so much performance for free, and it's just kind of, it's one of those things that really, I think, shows how young and how kind of Wild Westy that industry still is that there's simple tricks that we've kind of discovered that other people aren't really doing yet. So we've talked a lot about this, but just kind of dive into a case study on these titles. Starting a project, I was approached by Mariana from the Foundry and George to do the titles, and we, in our initial talks, knew that we wanted to kind of do something for VR because it's such an interesting space, and we really felt like not, on our end, not making a traditional title sequence, but making something that was more of an experience would be kind of a fun project for us. And doing that project in VR, you really don't have the same tools and kind of the same tropes that you would normally do titles with. It's normally a lot of macro shots and very quick cuts and lots of particles are everywhere and there's all this stuff going on, but in VR, that's assaulting and that's too much to look at and too much to take in and too much to handle. So, for us, we found it made more sense to do something that was more cinematic and more of a story and kind of see how we could tackle those problems. Because that's really where VR needs to get for it to be accessible and for it to succeed. You need to be able to go to the cinema and watch a movie and have it be a VR experience and have that be an enjoyable thing. So those were really those were the pain points that we were trying to tackle. And we began with testing and research, so figuring out how we were going to accomplish it at the same time as we were figuring out what we were going to accomplish. Because if you start off with a goal that is unachievable and you have no idea how you're going to actually do it, you're going to become discouraged, you're going to fail. Whereas if you kind of are figuring out how you're going to do it as you're figuring out what that goal is, you're going to have something that you can actually get done. And I think that's the important part, is that you need to be realistic about what you're doing. So the titles were created by myself and 2 other artists at our studio, kind of on weekend time and borrowed time from other projects. And we really knew that we couldn't do something crazy. We couldn't do something outlandish. We had to kind of keep it minimal. So for you guys who have seen the titles, it's a very simple story. And we fly through, the city, we fly out the tunnel. There's no one driving the ship. There's not a big dogfight. There's no giant laser explosions. It's, we kind of reined in all these crazy ideas that everyone had because we have to get a project done. And I think that's the important part, is kind of setting goals that you can obtain and you can achieve. Everyone says, oh, shoot for the moon and be crazy, but if you can't get that stuff done, it really doesn't get you anywhere. And on that path, map it out. Block out everything you can. If you want to make a VR game about ships shooting other ships, start with a triangle ship shooting boxes at another triangle ship. Like, start with the most basic thing you can possibly do and make that fun, and then kind of backfill from there. And I think you'll find that you don't really need all of the stuff that you think you need. We initially had a driver for the ship, and then we realized that the ship in the opening titles you don't ever really see in the cockpit. We don't have a driver. There's no one driving the ship. No one cares. No one sees it. So it's stuff like that where you kind of, if you can backfill, kind of working back from what you create in the end, you can figure out what you actually need to do. And then I think I touched on this a little earlier, but the biggest thing that helped us with our performance was just kind of creating a style that we could stick to, but that allowed us to have a game and have an experience that ran a little better on a phone. And those constraints, getting those defined early, testing is a big part of that. We built out kind of the entire city for the titles, and it was 6 times larger than it actually is here on the screen. And we took it into VR and found out that nothing, everything was so far away. It felt like you were in a giant empty auditorium that, maybe could hold a soccer match, except you were on a tiny dock that you expected to kind of have this distance that you just didn't have. So we built everything to real world scale that we normally would do for visual effects, but it just didn't make sense. And I think that testing, that early testing and kind of blocking everything in and working from box buildings and box city and box ships and kind of getting out how that would work, I think really helped us kind of define what we were looking for and what we were trying to build. And then when it comes to shipping, a finished product is better than a perfect product. And I think this is something that we're very used to in visual effects. We have very tight deadlines. We work on a lot of shows where we'll get a shot on a Tuesday and it'll be on air on a Thursday. So we know that everything can't be perfect, everything can't be great. So just get the crappiest version that you can done first, and then if you have time to make it better, great. But if you don't, at least it's done. At least there's something there. And I think a lot of other industries don't really operate on that same vein. You try to make the perfect product, you try to cover all of your bases, but in reality, people are so accepting of kind of rough edges. If you go to a website and the login doesn't quite work and you have to hit refresh and log in again, it's not the end of the world. But to developers and to the people that are building that website, it's the worst thing ever, and it's completely unacceptable. And I think there's a lot to kind of be, carried over and to be learned from doing visual effects and kind of not having everything just be absolutely perfect, because it's kind of okay. And to that, staying flexible, letting changes that happen early on in a project, be okay, trying to figure out what you're trying to accomplish, what you're trying to achieve. In the very first storyboards for this, we started out with this drone that was flying through and investigating all this stuff, and it ended up just taking up a ton of time and kind of not fitting with the story. So now there are just a couple wide shots of the city, and then we get right into it, and it saved us from making the drone, it saved us from doing all those shots and doing all that animation. So it's staying flexible and kind of figuring out what you're trying to do, I think is a huge part of it. And then distilling early and often. We, if you're making that game with the triangle ships shooting boxes at the other triangle ships, maybe those ships just stay triangles. Maybe it's fun, maybe it's enjoyable, maybe you don't have to build out the most realistic, crazy, futuristic ship that you've ever seen in your life. And I think, distilling those ideas down to their simplest form and being sure that you can achieve that, you can accomplish that, you can make a whole game of very low poly, kind of interesting looking ships and be done with it, or you could spend 2 years making the most complex ships in the world, and maybe people don't really care. Maybe people just want to play and enjoy your game. So I think kind of having that stuff is an important part of it as well. And then in closing, just talking about where VR is going. It feels like for every person who's really excited about VR and really thinks it's the next greatest thing, there's another person who dismisses it as a fad and is it's going to go the way of 3D and everything like that. And what I'll say is that we've been watching the same sort of televisions for 70 years. The answer to that isn't bigger, higher resolution televisions. We have to, at some point, experience media in a different fashion. And the fact that the biggest players in technology, Google and Microsoft and Facebook, are just throwing trucks of money at VR, I think is very telling. Did I make that not? I think I pushed a button. That's my bad. Is very telling. And I think that, for those industries to really care about VR and invest in VR as much as they are, I think is kind of a sign of the future. And they're just engaging experiences that, for me as an artist, I'm excited. I'm excited to explore filmmaking in such a new and novel way with rules that are not quite written and practices that aren't quite so steadfast. So for me, that's really exciting. And I just want to thank Pause for having me down here to Melbourne. The city is really lovely. It's my first time. I've never been. And I want to thank all the artists back at Ingenuity who are kind of hard at work so that I can be here talking to all of you.